David Wood Ministries welcomes you to the Soul Winning Directors Institute. For nearly 20 years, the focus of David Wood Ministries has been on revival and winning souls to Christ. The Soul Winning Directors Institute will teach you how you can build your church an aggressive evangelism program that produces scores of trained soul winners. And now, to welcome you to the Soul Winning Directors Institute, Dr. David Wood.
Welcome to the Soul Winning Directors Institute. In the next several sessions, you're going to learn how to recruit, how to train, how to remove the fear so that Christians can literally win people to Christ. Not only be an effective witness, but the fear is removed. Not only win them, but get them in church where they can begin to grow in grace and win others. All of this is covered, everything in detail. I am delighted that I'll be able to team teach these sessions with my son David. He has firsthand put all of these principles into place, built his own church under the leadership of the Holy Spirit. You'll discover some things that will really, I think, encourage you. But before we begin, it's very important that we answer a question. The question is this: what is a church? Vince Lombardi, that great Green Bay Packer football coach, one of the first that really we equate with leadership. It's very interesting the way he trained his team. Vince Lombardi would get those, those athletes together. Here they'd won the Super Bowl the year before. Most of them had 1 or 2 rings on, Super Bowl rings. People like Bart Starr, that great quarterback. And here they just won the Super Bowl. They'd come back in the next year for training. He would get them together. And he'd say, men, give me your attention. Give me your attention. The first thing that you need to know, in order to play football, the first thing you need to know, and he'd reach down and pick it up and lift it up, and he'd say, this is a football. This is a football. You know that sounds elementary, but I'm going to tell you there's a lot of people today that are in the area of church leadership, a lot of pastors, a lot of people that are in areas of the ministry, and most of the people that are seated in our pews every Sunday morning, and they do not know what is a church. We'd like to address that, if we may. What is a church? You see, the largest number of non-trained, non-mobilized people in America every week that are assembled together are in the pews of our Bible-preaching churches. Our Bible-preaching churches, we're loaded with people, but they're non-trained. They do not understand what their function is. They do not understand, very important, what the structure of the church is. That's what we want to deal with. And it's very, very important for us to understand that if we're going to build a church, we need to know what is a church. I'd like for you to envision with me for just a moment that, right here with me is a printing press. Most people understand what a printing press is. We can talk about a ditto machine. We can talk about a mimeograph machine or a large printing press. And, functionally, they all work the same. It's the greatest single illustration that I have ever used to describe what a church really is, a printing press. For you see, it has 3 different functions. A printing press has 3 different functions. And I'd like to illustrate that for you, if I may, because in there we find out what a church is, exactly the same way. In the center of this printing press, we'd have cylinders. That could be 2 cylinders, that can be 3, that can be 4, that'd be the ink rollers. Doesn't make any difference. Watch. We have a piece of paper that goes through the cylinders and comes out the other side. It goes in one side blank, it comes out the other side with an image on it. That's exactly the center section, what I call division number 2 of what a church is. And that division number 2 is what I call image. Make a note of that, image. It's important to understand, and I'm in this middle section, division number 2. We'll get to 1 and 3 in a moment. Image. Image, write it down, are your public services. Your public services. You see, when people walk into the church, and later on they walk out of the church, our job is to put an image on them. And that image is the image of Jesus Christ. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. We're trying to put the image of Jesus Christ on people. And so they come into the building, they walk out of the building, and we want to put the image of Jesus Christ on them. That's an exciting thing. Listen carefully. We have ministries in this whole arena of our public services that help us to do that function. We have the choir. We have the nursery. We have ushers and many, many others. There are many, many different ones. And all of these is very important for them to understand what are they really trying to do. For instance, a choir singer. Think with me for a moment. Somebody that sings in the choir that doesn't really understand that they're trying to communicate the image of Jesus Christ, they're not going to really sing. They're not going to use that responsible position the way they should. The same is true of nursery. The same is true of ushers. The same is true of the rest of it. Let's talk about the image of your church for just a moment. And I'm really talking about what impression does it put on people. I'm not talking about theology and doctrine of what a church is. I do not mean can we do a doctrinal disputation, some kind of Bible study on what a church really is. I'm dealing with the function of a church. People come onto the parking lot. What do they see? Do they know where to park? Do they know what door to come in? Do they know where the auditorium is? Do they know where the nursery is? Are the ushers there? What about the printed page we put in their hand? Does it look nice? What about that image of the church? What about the choir singing? What about the nursery program? All of this contributes to the image of a church. I normally think it's very good for us as leaders in the ministry to think about a young couple visiting our church. And they're somewhere around 35 years old. They're not saved, but they're good people, in quotes. You understand what I mean by that. They both have a job. They make about $100,000 a year together, both of them together. They have 2 children. One's nursery age, and one is, 3rd grade, something like that in the elementary. And so here they walk into the church, and nobody's in the nursery. The service starts late. If they go in the restroom, the paper's not there, or the restroom's dirty. And the choir, they drift up and drift back. And all of a sudden, these 2 unsaved people walk out of that building, and they have learned one thing, and that is not to come back and visit again. And really, the message, it didn't have a chance unless God overrules everything there. Thank God He can do that. But it's so much better for us to understand what are we supposed to do. First church I started, we had 32 people in the second one in Michigan, the first in South Carolina, 23 the first Sunday. We went to that first service in Michigan, 32 people, and I'll tell you what, we started on time. We had a bulletin printed. My wife did the singing. She's got a good voice, does a good job. We had a pianist. We had music. We had a sound system. I mean, it was like we'd been in business for 2 or 3 years. And when people came, here this brand new church, everything was the way it should have been. Image. Now, think with me for just a moment. Let's say you've got the absolute best choir in America, and the preaching's great, and the building's great, and everything's wonderful, and that public service is really just, that second section, that image is right there, but nobody's there. Nobody's in attendance. What good does it do? We preach the gospel, but nobody's there. So there's another section to that printing press, and let's go over to this side and understand it. It's a tray. And in that tray, we put paper. And this paper is fed through the machine. Write it down if you would. See, that middle section, I use the word image. But this first section, Roman numeral number 1, I use the word feeder. Feeder. We must feed paper into this press if we're going to print. We got to feed. And so there are ministries in your church that need to feed. It's very important. We need to feed. Now, I'm going to leave this in a moment and go to the other side, then come back to this so we can understand how they work together, because it's very important. Now, there are other words that you could use for the word feeder. You could use the word outreach. You could use the word evangelism. You could use the word soul winning. There's a lot of words we could use. I do not use words like that because it makes people come to preconceived ideas. I want us to understand the function. We've got to feed. That's what we're going to learn how to do. We're going to learn how to feed hundreds of people into our public services. The image ought to be what it should be. Yes, the preaching of the gospel and all the rest of it, but we've got to feed. We want to learn how to feed. We're going to talk about that. When I first went to Grand Rapids and started that second church, we had 32 people. I found that night 2 men that were there, and I said, "Men, would you go out and get a cup of coffee with me?" Those 2 men went out, we sat together, and I said, "Man, I want to make a commitment to you, and you make a commitment to me." And those 2 men became the core of what we began to do, and that is to train people in how to feed. I'll get to that in just a moment. But let's jump to the other side if we can. This other side is what we call the keeper. For instance, if you feed 100 sheets of paper through a printing press and it prints a perfect image on it, and yet it falls through the bottom, it, dog ears the pieces of paper, it double prints it, you have to throw the paper away, it's no good. So we need another division on this printing press over here, and the other division on the other side is another tray where the paper falls in. I'll call that the keeper. The keeper. You see, we've got other words we could use for this. Sometimes we get in this whole thing of building a church, we start to think which is the most important. We don't have that luxury. Hey, we must, if we're going to build a growing church, we've got to feed it with people, but wait a minute, we've got to keep the ones we reach. We've got to do this. Some people use the word over here, discipleship. Regardless of what word you want to use, I call it keeper because of the function. So watch, this printing press is operating the way it should. We're feeding paper into it. We're putting a perfect image on it. And we're keeping that when it comes out the other side. We're keeping it for use. And so what we're going to do very simplistically is understand that we've got ministries in the church. If this was a time where I had a whole group of pastors together, and I were to try to go into an intensive training time with the pastors, I would ask every preacher, and by the way, pastor, it would be good. The pastor of a church would be very good for you to do this. Write down every ministry in your church. Every ministry. Think about it with me for just a minute. Nursery, Sunday school, youth, bus, Christian school. It doesn't make any difference what it might be. Awana. We could go on and on and on. Jail ministry. And we can go into soul winning. All the different kinds. Write them down. Radio ministry, television ministry. It doesn't make any difference. I want you to think with me for just a moment. It's very important for discipline's sake that you understand that every ministry has but one function. Every ministry has but one function. The Bible said a double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. Very simply, I think God is teaching us a great lesson there. We've got to train our people to understand what their function is. What their function is.